especially welcome Henrike Lehnemann this year as our speaker, and also Dorothea Natras, Graham's wife, who is with us here from the family here tonight also. A warm welcome. Thank you also for bearing with us during the last 2 years when this annual event couldn't take place due to the COVID pandemic that we have had. And we are now back in swing to make this hopefully an annual event for you, jointly from the British Library and the German Studies Library Group, in memory of Graham Natras, who was our much loved head of the German and European collections, and also one of the founding members of the German Studies Library Group. Who would have thought that tonight we would have the lecture the day after the nation has yet again come to rule, and in context that this is a topic about German Protestantism, it seems to be fitting, and I'm sure also appreciated by would-be Graham and Dorothea, of course, to say a word about the Queen passing away yesterday, and we have heard a lot now how her faith, strong faith, shaped her sense of duty and service to the nation and to the world. So may she rest in peace, Queen Elizabeth II. Welcome, Henrike. This is indeed the lecture you had already promised us 2 years ago, before the pandemic hit us. And thank you for revamping the topic and making it fit for the year 2022 also. So your lecture will be Wittenberg 1522, 500th year anniversary, print, culture and soundscapes of the Reformation. Henrike, we first met at the German Church in London, in Newcastle, when you were very active in the German parish, again, theme of religion, theology and Protestantism. And at the time, you were the chair of German at Newcastle University. And Newcastle being then only one station of your career and your life, before becoming chair of medieval literature and linguistics at Oxford University and being a fellow at St. Edmund's Hall. You have a very impressive personal biography and career. You grew up in 3 medieval towns in Germany, Münster, Lüneburg and Nuremberg. They have sort of shaped your interest in medievalism. You studied in many cities, Bamberg, Edinburgh, Göttingen, Berlin and Tübingen. And you held appointments in many impressive cities and institutions, namely at Tübingen, at Newcastle, now in Oxford, and you are also you own a research fellowship at Freiburg University by the Volkswagen Stiftung. Your inspiration, and we are impressed by how your biography and your personal path matches your academic interest and research interest, and how you managed to bring these two strands together. So where you grew up shaped your interest in medievalism. Recently, you have launched a project funded by the Henkel Stiftung, about letters of the nuns of the Lüne Kloster, that's in Lüneburg. You have also launched the Nuns Network project, that sounds very interesting. And in 2020, there was a film podcast about the Nuns Network, and the Norddeutscher Rundfunk broadcast that. You are also chair, or were chair, of Women in German Studies, so the feminine sort of activism in the Germanistic is also a strong quest of you. Your research interests are, of course, medieval manuscripts, the relationship between text and image, the Latin and the vernacular, and indeed the Reformation, printing, translation, and printing in the Reformation. So over to you, Wittenberg, 1522. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's a true honor and pleasure to be here with you. And when Dorothea asked me 2 years ago to give the lecture according to bringing together the interests of Graham Netflix with the holdings of the British Library, I thought, wonderful, I'll talk about something in 1520. And then when it now was postponed, I thought, again, what does this mean? And I'm very pleased to see in the audience also one of my former students who has sat patiently through most of what I've been lecturing on Reformation. And I think you actually had to write the essay topic whether the proper date for a centenary of the Reformation is 1517 or 1520. And I would add now today, actually, we should celebrate the quincentenary in 1522, because that's a point where really the movement of the Reformation comes into its own. And this can be shown by looking at the print culture of the period, but I would argue also we have to add in the performance element. It's not enough just to print it, you have to communicate the publication. So that is the theme I'm going to explore today, how the Reformation is an evolving movement that moves through from 1517, when Luther didn't nail the 95 Theses, he was much cleverer and also not as practical to use a hammer. He used something that had much more impact than a hammer, namely the printing press. So the proper definition of impact is to press letters on paper, not to take a hammer to a nail. And this is actually the type that my students, the history of the book students, master students, put together in the form, in the Bodleian library press. You see in Richard Lawrence's handwriting, Luther Thesis on the top and a lino-cut initial standing in for the type. And we learned a lot when producing this, also how easy it is to do typos, how time pressure works with printers. So it brought a new appreciation of the art of printing and how to find a workable pathway between speed and fidelity, how to hit the right moment with your publications. And one of the people visiting me while we were typesetting this was my colleague Thomas Kaufmann, Reformation historian from Göttingen, who has just this year published another book about the exact title being Wie die Generation Luther die erste Medienrevolution entfesselt. How Generation Luther sparked the first media revolution. But it turned out he had never handled a printing press before coming to Oxford, and it really changed his approach. So the materiality of things and testing it yourself is very important. And so a lot of publication has actually been done on this print revolution, but not so much about really how this was spread out. The importance of orality coming in, and particularly the importance of singing. We heard the choir sing one of the hymns, which was actually written exactly 500 years ago by a former nun, Elisabeth von Meseritz, who left in 1522 the convent in the Baltic because she had heard Bugenhagen preach, went to Wittenberg, and there came into a situation that was teeming with excitement, because just when she arrived, the Neue Testament Deutsch had been published in September by Martin Luther, who had spent the summer cooped up on the Wartburg, just with a New Testament edition by Erasmus and a dictionary, and had in one go translated the New Testament into German. And what he did when he came back to Wittenberg was, on the one hand, supervise the printing process, on the other hand, issuing a call for hymn writing, because he realized the gospel needed to be spread further beyond those who could read for themselves. So to communicate the central messages of the New Testament, he enlisted the help of others, and he called seine liebe Lise, dear Lizzie, the Elisabeth von Meseritz, who then married one of his students, Caspar Kruziger, and set about to try to bring this into song. I've listed here the journey from 1517 to 1522, which can be seen as a widening of the appeal of the message. So the 95 Theses, printed in Latin for a learned audience in the form of an academic disputation. And then in the following year, and we'll see copies of that in a second, actually I can call that up, the Sermon von dem Ablass und Gnade durch den würdigen Doktoren Martinum Luther Augustiner zu Wittenberg gemacht. So he summarized his 95 Theses in just a short sermon, so a version that was both in the vernacular, translating it, and delivering it orally. And this also used then a much more appealing format, because as you can see, we had difficulties putting these 95 Theses through the press, because the press wasn't big enough, and also we didn't have enough standing type to print the Roman numerals. We ran out of X's for the 95. So printers were interested in having a format that could be typeset in a day and distributed more easily. So the Sermon von dem Ablass und Gnade fitted on one sheet. And we've actually reconstructed how this sheet would have been printed. And here I must mention Emma Huber, who has been pivotal in getting all this from the ancient historic materiality through the digital into the new materiality of a reconstructed facsimile. So we have been starting this series of tailor editions together, which produce facsimiles. Emma, if you could just hand round perhaps the Sermon von Ablass und Gnade. So all of these editions have a full facsimile at the end, a critical edition and a book historical introduction to it, and they come with add-ons such as this fold your own pamphlet download, which Susan Reed kindly printed out this afternoon, even quicker than the Basel printer. And when we were doing this, we discovered that actually this copy here, which is a Basel print, we have Alissa Steiner here who's worked on Basel printing, so they were skilled and quick workers, but would do this just in an afternoon session. And you can see how quickly it is done, because the woodcut is just cut to pieces. On the top there is a Roman initial that doesn't fit to it, and even more hilarious, the title woodcut for it is a man handling a rosary, because it's vaguely religious, but it's exactly against what Luther is writing. So the British Library has 4 copies of the Sermon from 4 different editions, which shows how quickly this spread just in 1 year, and also how it was both a bestseller and a long seller. So on the left-hand side you have the 1520 reprint, and I'll hand round these 2 sheets, and you can compare how a learned edition. So the British Library only has the learned editions. They don't have the popular Basel version that throws in the woodcuts. Before I hand it round, just to explain, so you would typeset the whole pamphlet, all 8 pages of it, put it into a frame first, the front page. So you had these 8 separate typeset pages, put the 4 of these into a frame like that, and then printed X number of copies. Then you set it aside, took the other 4 pages, put them on the same press and printed the back of it. But what must have happened here is when they were printing the back side of it, one apprentice already took apart the front to use it for the next project. But the printer must have realized, Pamphilius Gengbach, that he was onto a real bestseller, because he kept printing the backside. So we have 10 surviving copies, and in all 10 copies this side is identical, but this side is different, exists in 2 different versions. So obviously he had to tell the apprentice to quickly put together back the front page to keep printing. So that gives you an insight into how quickly developing the situation was. Emma, if you could hand out these 2 copies. An adjustment already from 1517 to 1518 in terms of format, in terms of language, in terms of sellability. So you could buy a pamphlet of this length just for the coffee to go price. And then Luther kept developing from there this kind of success formula by continuing to publish first German versions and then Latin versions. Interestingly enough, what Ulrich Bubenheimer, a Reformation specialist, has been able to show for both von der Freiheit eines Christenmenschen and for the Passional Christi und Antichristi, Luther and his colleagues kept drafting in Latin. That was the language they had grown up with, and they had learned to argue and analyze things, but published their own German version and translation first, because that was the bigger market, and the learned people could wait. If those who look at the fold-out compare the two editions, one is really for a learned audience and has Latin annotations, the one printed in Leipzig. The one that also the British Library has shows that an academic has worked through it, while the Pamphilius Gengenbach is the popular version. What is added in 1521 as next kind of widening circle of communication and appeal is the visual element. Emma, could you please pass around as next the Passional Christi und Antichristi, which is a highly effective visual attack on the papacy. If you look at from the back where the facsimile is, you can see it's putting woodcuts on the left-hand side. What Jesus does on the right-hand side was, or Christ does, the Antichrist does. So, and guess who the Antichrist is? So Christ is washing the feet of the disciples. The Pope has his feet kissed. Jesus is driving out the moneylenders from the temple. The Pope takes in the indulgences. And the last double spread, if you start from the very back of the booklet, is Christ rises up to heaven. Guess what? The Antichrist goes down to hell. And then now we've caught up with our quincentenary. The New Testament is practically the first genuinely German publication, or of course it's a translation, but not from a Latin that Luther has done, but written as an idiomatic German text, which wasn't unchallenged. So actually the first Reformation pamphlet we did was Martin Luther's defending his own translation principle, Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen. And we are just we are just working on a second edition, which will come out for Reformation Day this year, to coincide now with the 1522 New Testament translation. I've interspersed it with two elements of the story so far. One is the development of music printing. So we know that there were earlier publications, because the first hymn books that we have, I've reconstructed some of the choirs, only survive in single copies, because they were completely zersungen, sung to pieces. So they were text booklets to be used and not to be put on a shelf, other than the magnificent September Testament, which you would cherish and dust and so on. This was something to be passed from hand to hand, taken to the church to sing from it, taken home for private devotion. So we can tell from certain typos in the first surviving hymnals that they were obviously copying earlier forms. So we can assume that as soon as Luther had written the letters to his friends asking for versification of biblical messages, things were printed, probably also in single leaf broadsheets that could be bought at the street corner. And so Emma, if you could just hand around this, which is just one sheet from the first surviving Protestant hymn book, the Enchiridion geistlicher Gesänge und Psalmen, which survived glued into the back cover of a learned volume by a humanist, which was chained to the bookshelf, so as a kind of appendix to a library book, it survived. So praise to libraries. And the other level I've interspersed is the development in England, because while many people will be aware that Miles Coverdale used for the first full English Bible some of Luther's translation, because he didn't have Greek and Hebrew, so he translated from the Vulgate and from Latin sources, but tried to correct it following the Luther's translation based on the original languages. So it's particularly noticeable in the Psalms, which are still sung in the version of the Book of Common Prayers, which is Coverdale's Psalter, not the King James Psalter. And you can sometimes hear echoes of Luther's psalm phrasing in the phrasing of the Book of Common Prayers. But even before he did that, he translated the first hymns that came out. And again, that points to the importance of oral communication and circulation via multiplicators. So he could have picked up, for example, Low German versions of the hymns that were coming with the Hanseatic trade into the contour in London. So the this is a 1525 Low German hymn book. Which didn't print the tunes, so it can't be the direct copy for Miles Coverdale, because he has hymn tunes that are clearly based on a written copy. But it shows how this circulated. So Coverdale was both in the Netherlands traveling and in northern Germany, so he must have picked up the hymns there. All right, now I'm coming to 1522 and the background of other publications in that year. I forgot that I wanted to read you just one paragraph from the Sermon von Ablass und Gnade, just to show how Luther adapts when translating to a much more direct rhetoric and very idiomatic way of speaking. So this is the end, the last bullet point zum 20. of the sermon von Ablass und Gnade, and I've also picked it because he refers to sounds. Zum 20. Ob etzlich mich nu wohl ein Ketzer schelten, denn solch Wahrheit sehr schädlich ist im Kasten, so acht ich doch solch Geplärre nit groß. Sintemal das nit tun, dann etzlich finster Gehirne, die Biblien nie gerochen, die christlichen Lehrer nie gelesen, ihr Eigenlehrer nie verstanden, sondern in ihren locherten und zerrissenen Opinien viel nach verwesen. Dann hätten sie die verstanden, so wüssten sie, dass niemand sollten lästern, unverhohrt und unüberwunden. Doch Gott geb ihnen und uns rechten Sinn. Amen. Gedruckt nach Christi Gebot und so weiter. Now we come to 1522, and Susan was very patient in ordering up whatever I fished out with the keywords Wittenberg 1522 from the British Library catalogue. I've since found there's much more to be explored, but this is just a short selection of things that appeared in the same year as the September Testament. And I've brought the September Testament since I couldn't bring over the original in a facsimile which has the same size. Also, after I've now circulated these tiny hymn book and the still pocket-sized sermon, this is a proper library book, something to be put on a lectern, to be read by a group of people. So Emma, could you circulate that? Yeah. So in a way, this was the project the Wittenberg printers had been training for all the previous years. Luther had made sure, when he arrived in Wittenberg, there was only one printer, Rau Grünenberg, who was known for his typos, and so Luther asked for, encouraged further printers and promised them there would be enough to survive on. And so by 1522, there was a whole street full of print workshops. And this is done by a true professional, so no cut-off woodcuts or random throw-in initials. This is proofread and typeset from beginning to end. And Luther just wanted the title, not his name as translator on it, but with a programmatic Deutsch after das Neue Testament put in. And the first thing he puts in is a list of books. And you would think that's something objective and controversial, but it isn't. And this is something that a reader of one of the British Library pocket editions noticed. So I've photographed, I didn't want to put the original of the September Testament as a book rest under the, so this is the facsimile copy that's just circulating, but on top is the real copy of das Neue Testament Deutsch, printed in Strasbourg, also in 1522. So you see how quickly that spread. And this is a copy not to be put on a lectern, but that's something to carry around with you, to annotate. And the reader was obviously amused by Luther's preface, which justifies the way in which he has sorted the books. And you see, either here or in the circulating copy, the first 24 items have numbers, and the last 4 don't. And the reason for that is that Luther sorted the books according to how close they were to the gospel and the message of redemption by grace and grace alone. So he ups Paul's letters and disses the letter to the Hebrews, the letter of James, the letter of Jude, and the Apocalypse he puts to the end because it talks about the end of time. So that's for a slightly different reason. But he was particularly against the letter of Jude because it seemed to say there are things when redemption becomes impossible. So grace isn't any longer possible. And so he says at the end, darum ist St. Jakobs Epistel eine rechte Strohan-Epistel. So it's a really straw letter. And I think, but I have only seen it 2 hours ago for the first time, I think this is a straw hat. Or do you have any other explanation for the doodle next to it? So I think the reader was amused by this type of simile for James as something. Straw obviously refers to something where you have taken out the nutritious element of wheat and just the padding is left, or what's only fit to feed to animals or to have for animals to lie on, and not for Christian people to feed upon. So you can see that his typesetting signals were picked up by the readers of the books in the British Library. What also came out are a number of kind of tie-in products to the New Testament, explaining particular doctrines, and first and foremost among that is that the sacraments should be taken under both forms. The title reads Das Hauptstück. The British Library Catalogue has corrected the typo, and so the catalogue reads Hauptstück, which is certainly what was meant, and Hauptstück is neither Low German nor High German, it's simply a typo. But it's quite funny that it's when it's saying it's the main thing. You also see where the British Library got it from a duplicate sale of the Berlin State Library. So that was the way in which British institutions in the 19th century mainly acquired Reformation material via duplicate. So if you look through the facsimiles here, on the Pamphilius Gengenbach, you see also a stamp duplum, which is from Heidelberg University Library, who used the money they got from the sale to build a new, a rather representative library building. And you see this is in all probability already a reprint of something. An indication for that is always if the woodcut is mirrored. So normally good people are gesturing to the right, baddies are coming from the right. So since it's obviously arguing in favor of Luther, unless it's taken from an anti-papist print and the monk is originally not Luther and just here taken in. But I think it's more probable, since it's also a very kind of basic cut, woodcut, that it's something that had been copied from another woodcut that was from left to right gesturing. And this is again using orality to spread key messages from the Bible edition, which obviously couldn't be bought by everybody, while this bite-sized explanation was easily available. And you can see again an indication how hastily these things were put together, since you can faintly see a mirror image of the last page on the for recto, and that must have happened. Normally you would hang sheets to dry for at least 24 hours before folding them to let the ink dry, and somebody must have been so eager to sell it and to read it that they folded it before the ink was completely dry. And then you see from the bite-sized sermons, Luther then develops the next more programmatic pamphlet. So here he put together all the new things that had been introduced in Wittenberg by 1522. So that is taking the Eucharist under both forms. That is the permission to eat meat on Fridays. So and that is also the introduction of vernacular singing in the services. So the congregation was integrated. And they started first with hymns that were already in circulation. So there is the medieval form of the so-called Leisen, so hymns that end with the word Kyrie leis. And Luther made sure, if somebody looks at the last page of this folded sheet of hymns. The last page is Christ ist erstanden gebessert. So Christ ist erstanden is one of these Leisen. Christ ist erstanden von der Mutter alle, sollen wir alle froh sein. Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie leis. And Luther takes that, which was a way in which the lay people could integrate because they knew this, and then makes a more complex hymn, but starts with a tune that people would know. So, Christ lag Todesbehandeln, für unsere Sünd gegeben, is then the hymn he writes based on the Leisen. So this is leafing further through the pamphlet. Another topic that became virulent at that point is the again, a contemporary user has put a marginal note on the Missbrauch der Bild, so the misuse of images. And that is Luther's explanation, saying you have now to preach about the right engagement with visual art. It's images aren't to be venerated, they are used as didactic examples, such as in the Passional Christi and Antichristi, but not for worshipping. So you have a kind of a circular movement. You have the New Testament setting out the full scale of Christ's teaching. Then you have the sermons, you have pamphlets developed from the sermons, and then going back into sermons such as this one, ein Sermon durch Martinum Luther zu Wittenberg, gepredigt von den Bildnissen, which again integrates two topics that were certainly dear to the heart of probably many of the congregation, whether to eat meat or not. I'll only briefly touch upon the last pamphlet I'd ordered up for 1522. It's also the year in which Luther answers all the pamphlet that had come out from Henry VIII. And he does that, of course, in Latin as the international language that would also be understood across the channel. But that's for another day. I'll come now to the soundscape. And imagine yourself being the young nun, she was probably just 18, 19 years old, Elisabeth von Meseritz, traveling to Wittenberg, and what she could have heard there on the streets and in the pubs and in the houses of people. And one would be the art form developed by the artisans in the 15th century, the Meistersinger, that who took biblical topics and turned them into song, but also took things like here, ein schön Meistergesang, wie die groß und mächtig Stadt Troja zerstört ward, durch die schönen Königin Helena aus Griechenland, in des Regenbogen langen Ton. Regenbogen was one of the poets of the 13th century who were adopted as model for how to write a proper hymn in a form that had Stollen, a certain bar structure that developed in an Aufgesang and an Abgesang. Der Aufgesang, so singing up in a repetition of an A part, then the Abgesang, the B part, ending with the same cadenza as the A part. And that is something that we can find in most of the hymns of the first hymn book. You also have, I should have taken out the hyperlink, so you can't read, but you can read the proper title, ein hübsch neu Liede, genannt das Vogelgesang. Ein ander Liede, ist der Morgensterne erleuchtet, etc. So songs that were too short to fill a full broadside were just combined with other songs. So and there you have really a crossover between secular and spiritual songs. So this is the song about the Morgenstern, which can develop in two directions. So either you can say, you can turn it into a love song, a dawn song that is lamenting the rise of the literal morning star because it means the lovers have to part, or you can praise Christ as the morning star that leads to a new day. And this one is a secular one, singing about the lover who has gone away at dawn, but slightly strangely ends with a doxology. Gott Vater, Gott Sohn, Jesu Christ und Gott Heiliger Geist, lass dir die Allerschönsten befohlen sein, lass dir sie befohlen sein. So there are these popular songs circulating, I don't know, with a crossover to that. But what Elisabeth von Meseritz would also encounter, since it was a university town and since she had studied in a convent that laid great stock by teaching of the 7 liberal arts, a formal introduction to music composition, how to set a song in 4 parts, and how to arrange a tune according to the proper Pythagorean system. So, and you have some nice putty. What you also had was, of course, I ordered that up more or less by mistake because I searched for anything that the British Library had having Gesang and being published somewhere between 1520 and 1530, and up came Das Wolfgesang, which is in fact along the lines of the Passional Christi und Antichristi, an anti-papal pamphlet, but with a nice bagpipe playing wolf at the bottom left-hand corner, playing on a so the tune she composed or adapted was actually then taken from secular songbooks, and I haven't brought along a facsimile of the Lochamer Liederbuch, which is a southern German book, but one northern German copy, the Rostocker Liederbuch, which was a songbook put together by students at the University of Rostock, and shows how that combines Low German and High German influences. And the Lochamer Liederbuch combines dance tunes and love songs together to be played with a lute. So this is another page from the same volume, which shows a lute accompaniment. And she adapted this, so I'll just sing you this one verse of the love song, and then I'll sing you the one verse of Elisabeth Kruziger's hymn based on this. Mein Freund möchte sich wohl mehren, wollt Glück mein Helfer sein. Glück tät mich ernähren, verwund mein sehnlich Pein. Ich hätt mir auserlesen ein mindigliches Weib, an der steht all mein Wesen, ich kann an sie nicht She turns that into Herr Christ der Einigkeit, Sohn, Vaters in Ewigkeit, aus sein Herzen entsprossen, gleich wie geschrieben steht. Er ist der Morgensterne, sein Glänze streckt der Ferne, vor anderen Sternen klar. That's the hymn they were singing earlier in the entrance hall to the British Library. So you see, she slightly shortens the tune, keeps the dance-like movement, but instead of praising the minnigliche Weib, the lovely women, she uses the uprising of the Abgesang to praise the morning star. So, er ist der Morgensterne. He is the morning star. And in this case, it's not the lover, or it is the lover, but Christ as the lover. And that are actually elements she would have brought with her from the convent, but then combines it with a Lutheran creed. So from Christ as the morning star, she goes through the second verse, and I know there are some in the audience who sang earlier the hymn. So if anybody wants to join me in singing the second verse, you are very welcome. I've put on the right-hand side not a literal translation of the second verse, but the singable English translation. And actually, so why don't we sing the English version? Might make it easier for some. Which was done by Coverdale in his ghostly psalms and spiritual songs, which only survives in one copy. In this case, not because it was zersungen, but because it ended up on the index. The English king wasn't amused by it, and so most copies were burned. And this one survived, bound together with other pamphlets, and in the Queen's College Library in Oxford. Let's do it like that. I'll sing the German, and then everybody can join in repeating the English translation. Für uns ein Mensch geboren, im letzten Teil der Zeit, der Mutter unverloren, ihr jungfräulich Keuschheit, den Tod für uns zerbrochen, den Himmel aufgeschlossen, das Leben wiederbracht. Now everybody. He was for us a man born in the last part of time, yet kept Gemeinheit unverloren, his mother might bear him. He hath hell gates broken, and heaven hath he made open, bringing us life again. Well done. Coverdale was more of a theologian than a musician. And so perhaps it's not just because the other copies were burned that hymn singing didn't take off until the Methodists came in England, but also because the translation wasn't. All right, so to come to a conclusion, Luther said about baptism, Wasser allein tut's freilich nicht. equally, it could be said about publishing. Papier allein tut's freilich nicht. On paper and printing alone, the Reformation couldn't have taken off. It takes the communication and contextualization. It takes people such as Elisabeth von Meseritz setting the text into singable form, and it takes the librarians to make sure the printed text reaches people today. So many thanks to the German Studies Library Group for keeping the texts alive and bringing them to new audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lehnemann. Wasser allein tut's nicht, Printing auch nicht. That was a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much for covering that wide scope of time and aspects and taking us back to the 16th century and also concluding with a Gesangseinlage. It was wonderful. Much appreciated. Just before we go to something that's not Wasser, but something better, any questions, please, for Henrike? Maybe just one or two questions, because then we need to press on.
Can I ask a very unintellectual question? When did the idea of the hammering on the door come?
It's not an anti-intellectual. It's very interesting. The hammering comes first up after Luther's death, when people are looking to find a unifying date, to pin down, literally, when did this movement actually start. And they didn't want so it was taken in a way a metaphor literally. So the idea was Luther is hammering the nails into the coffin of the Middle Ages, or the papacy. And I mean, academic theses were regularly, in fact, put on church doors with glue. So it could have happened. It's not that it's completely implausible. It's just that we don't have any evidence for it from Luther's time, and there is quite a lot suggesting that it was something that fitted people's agenda to have this symbolic act. It probably was much less programmatic, at least the proclamation, and Luther actually had written it to be sent off to people like the bishop. But when it really comes into force is then 1617. So when the Protestant different states are trying to unite in the 30-year war and find a shared identity, and that comes by instituting a centenary. So they were looking for a date, and I've done it for much lesser things. So we needed something to celebrate in Newcastle, so I just looked through the archives. Is there anything that happened 50 or 100 years ago which we could celebrate? And a bit it was like that. So they urgently needed something in 1617 to bring the Presbyterian and the Lutheran factions together, and this was the common enemy, arguing against indulgences and Catholicism, rather than commemorating Luther's death or having something that would be just for the Lutheran side. If they had been looking for something in 1622, we might now be celebrating or commemorating the Reformation always at the 22 dates.
Well, thank you very much. And Großinger Hymn is indeed here, number 67.
Oh yeah, I brought that along the current Protestant hymn book to show that it's still the core of the current hymn books, and in fact hymn books become a kind of signature publication or signature object for Protestantism.
Well, thank you again, Henrike. It was wonderful. Thank you.